Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and this is Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in national and international affairs, history, and culture. There are places on this earth, desolate, forbidding places, where one expects the worst to happen. Rwanda is not one of them. Yet 1 decade ago, this small but strikingly beautiful country was the stage for a massive outpouring of evil, the systematic murder of nearly 1 million of the men, women, and children of a land caught up in a frenzy of violence. The world community failed the challenge of helping Rwandans in their hour of greatest need. Apathy, indifference, disdain, and cold-blooded calculations of national interest provided the motive and logic of inaction. But some did try to stop the slaughter. For them, it remains a soul-searing memory. From their witness to such horror, perhaps the rest of us can resolve to elevate humanity to its rightful place in the affairs of nations. My guest today is General Romeo Dallaire, who commanded the United Nations Force sent to Rwanda in 1993, and who is author of Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. General Dallaire, welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's a delight to have you here, and let me start out by saying this book merits many strongly positive words. Riveting is not the least of them.
So, thank you.
Thank you, and I want to talk about many of the themes that come through this book. Let me start this way, General, by characterizing it from one reader's point of view. It struck me as being several things at once: detailed testimony, a searing indictment, a very heartrending account of an awful tragedy and something which haunts you personally, I know, very much. But you also said in the first chapters a number of times that you wrote it to fill a void. I'd like you to tell us just briefly, what did you mean by that? What void are you seeking to fill with this book?
Well, there have been a number of scholarly and journalistic books and pamphlets and so on that have been written on the Rwandan genocide. The bulk of them have been written by people who were not there at the time. Also, the thrust of nearly all these publications has been one of going back into history, which is sort of the colonial period and pre-colonial period, and then leaping into the actual genocide, and then dissecting the different interplay of the world powers, the UN, the NGOs, and all that. What my book was attempting to do, both in its written form and also psychologically for me, was to tell the story of an inside player. And as that, what were my reactions, my decisions, what was influencing me throughout that time frame, and writing it with the knowledge of that time. So I produced no revisionism or Monday morning quarterbacking. I wrote as what happened then, and I spent a lot of time explaining the lead up.
Right, indeed you do.
From months beforehand to the genocide and then the genocide. And I think that was the major vacuum, is actually someone from the inside telling what was all the different complex interfaces.
Absolutely. It has the quality, and I guess the word I would use, of eyewitness, if you will. Eyewitness to exactly what happened. It's also your personal story, and I think it's important for those watching to get a sense of Romeo Dallaire as you went there. And I'm struck by several things, because you give us insight into what I would call the vocation of a soldier. In this way, Romeo Dallaire, with many qualities, among them these, a Canadian. I think that's important because there's a peacekeeping tradition that's very strong in Canada's history. A man who comes from a long familial history of military connection, you and your wife's family as well.
Yes.
And then, as if that were not enough, we have a man who is very much at home in a bilingual setting and with different ethnic peoples in society. I'm just wondering, when one has all of that and the rank of a general going into a situation like that, getting off that plane, arriving there, did you go there with a tremendous sense of confidence, of can-do, this is something that I'm really going to make work?
The initial reconnaissance to bring to the Security Council a report as whether or not there was subject there that would permit a peace agreement. I went into that with just open eyes and wanting to be a sponge, and from that take a decision. However, as that experience was played out over a couple of weeks, and then nearly a month of the intrigues inside the halls of the UN and all the different nations with their representatives, when I saw the mission being agreed to, ultimately, not what I wanted, but what I felt I could work with in a minimum viable way, then it was a near elation. From great joy of getting an operational command, finally, in a foreign land, to an objective analysis, and then to the elation of command, actually going to be in the field and partake in the advancement of a peace agreement for our people.
Well, this is all going to, I appreciate that answer, because I think it shows the contrast, that kind of buoyancy and optimism, and it all dissolves in a terrible horror that you did end up witnessing. Leaping ahead, because I think one of the things the book does in your life, since the episodes of a decade ago certainly prove, it gave you a lot of insight into what armies, progressive armies, let's say, armies interested in peacekeeping and nation building may be confronted with now. I mean, is soldiering in the 21st century ideally a different kind of enterprise when you think of building? Is there a different kind of commitment and
we're into a different scenario. We have the vestiges and the responsibility of classic warfare still, nation against nation and identifiable enemies and the use of all weapons and all that kind of stuff, as we have the responsibility of protecting our nation.
Right.
And so that eventuality is always there. And until a politician can tell a general that that's absolutely never going to happen again, the generals will always be hedging their bets on having to commit to classic warfare.
Right.
However, this era, this post-Cold War era that started nearly 15 years ago, and which is flourishing sometimes negatively in these times, has articulated to the military, and not through formal process, but in fact through an osmosis process, is that warfighting is simply not enough. That being a warrior is just not enough. We need you to also be a conflict resolver. We need you to be able to function in ambiguity. We need you to be able to be proactive in some of the most complex scenarios of peace and human rights, ethical and moral dilemmas that so many of these missions are bringing forward. And so you need a whole new set of skills. What the older crowd, conservative crowd, are saying, you fiddle in this softer stuff to a serious way, and you will attrit the warrior ethic. And my argument to that is you need a balance between the two, and that the warrior ethic will not be attritted, because the warrior ethic is very much based on experiential aspects, whilst the soft skills of the conflict resolution requires a more intellectual basis. And as such, like philosophy and anthropology and sociology, as such, the intellect of the leadership will guarantee that warrior ethic will not only stay alive, but be present when it absolutely has to be used, but that it is operating with other options.
Exactly.
And so we're into quite a debate of the future of soldiering.
It sounds to me like a sea change, General, in the sense that it calls, I would think, at every rank, from general to private, for greater sophistication and a number of disciplines now bearing on what you do, and for nations, especially powerful nations like ours, the understanding that there's a long-term commitment here. It's not just fight and leave.
That's right. The short-term exercises are over. If you're going to be in these complex areas to support and assist them, then you're in there for decades.
Right.
And in fact, creating milestones, artificial milestones of setting up a democratic election in 2 years and so on, exacerbate the complexities that there. we must evolve with them in as much as providing them with a sustained support.
Right.
Not being paternalistic, not being neo-colonialist in any way, shape, or form. And so the military dimension of that is, in fact, in the midst of a revolution.
Right.
It's not a change. It's not certainly not an evolution. It's not a reform. It's actually a revolution.
A revolution.
And as such, you're asking the soldiers to be intellectually strengthened. And contrary to the old chain of command where, the general knew everything and passed down what the soldier needed as a minimum, the corporal on a barrier taking the wrong decisions can scuttle the negotiations of a peace agreement for months.
That's right.
And so there's no more blue-collar soldiering. And it's not because of the technology. It's because of the intellectual
You
depth.
make me think that everyone at every rank, every man or woman in uniform in those situations is not only a soldier but an ambassador as well. There seems to have that dimension to it from what you
In fact,
say.
that's rather an interesting analogy, because some of the skills we want them to have is exactly skills of negotiation, skills of patience,
Right.
of listening, and throwing out sometimes an innovative idea. And that's got to be done at the corporal level just as much as the general
At the
level.
flag rank.
Yeah.
General, this book, as I said, is on so many levels. It's rich in each one of them. I want to take us now back historically to those terrible moments when everything turned sour and awful and tragedy ensued. And as I said at the outset, and I think any reasonable person would have to agree, the world community failed miserably. Many countries, including, quite frankly, this one, ours, I think failed in that. And I guess the central question, sir, if there are lessons to be taken, is why? Painful as the question may be, could it be that there's a perception that some people just aren't as important or as others might be? I mean, Frank, you're a man of candor. The book's candid. What went wrong?
Well, I think, as I spoke recently in Rwanda, I was supposed to speak to a class of about 100 students at the university and ended up in a stadium with 7,000 people. In the brutality of the genocide, I think you got to be brutal also in the explanations. Brutal that
And
is
honestly,
bringing those
yeah.
facts out. And in the brutality of it, Rwanda and Rwandans just didn't count. I mean, they were worth nothing to national interests. No strategic value, geography, resources, and all that were there, as I was told, were humans, and there were too many of them. It's overpopulated. And so, yes, I think the reactions to Africans killing themselves and having it banalized as being tribalism, yet Yugoslavia, which we poured in billions and tens of thousands of troops, being considered something far more sophisticated and more significant, is the perfect example that we are still responding to the fact that the answer to the question of are all humans human or are some more human than others is, yeah, some are more human than others, and so they're more pertinent. We don't want casualties in trying to save Rwandans because we cannot handle these casualties. And so whether there's 100, 200, 300,000 Rwandans killed, it's still not warranting the decision of the political process to be able to sustain public opinion by saying, yeah, it's important that we send people there. And then, okay, we've got 4, 5, 6, 8, or 10 casualties. That blood of our own is crucial to the advancement of humanity and the respect of humanity, and not simply there because we want the oil, we want the strategic location, or whatever.
I think the whole book, and the answer you just gave, which was in fact extremely honest and candid, is an argument for humanity as the first principle for international action, if I understood it correctly. I mean, it's all the real politics stuff that you hear, you're saying that's secondary to what human beings should be all about for each other. At another important level, the book is a moral story, obviously, in every sense. And I want to actually quote something now to give people a sense of that. Actually, it's an object lesson, if you don't mind me saying it, that you got early on in this, and I guess they continue throughout. This is early when you're sort of assessing things and trying to get your feet on the ground in terms of what the mission will need from the UN and so
Very
forth. So you're talking to the people, and here's this passage begins, and you think it's been a very successful meeting, by the way, but the passage begins, I did not understand that I had just met men in Rwanda who would become genocidaires, genocidal killers. While I thought I was the one who had been doing the assessing, I was the one who had been carefully measured. I still thought, for the most part, that people said what they meant, and you go on to describe how these men with very sophisticated backgrounds obviously weren't saying what they meant. And then you get to this riveting sentence at the end of that paragraph, and I want you to comment on this whole passage, though, where you say, they knew us better than we knew ourselves. And what I took from that was evil always seems to know its own mind, and it's up to the good to figure things out as quickly as they can.
One of the terrible things we do from our haughty positions in the developed world is consider people in the non-developed world as dummies. And in fact, the premises were such that there was not level of sophistication in the intellectually, but also practically in how to move public opinion, how to influence international public opinion, and in fact, how to maneuver their country to the best advantage that they have, particularly if they're operating as the hardliners and the extremists in a totally non-ethical scenario. And so they knew exactly what they were doing. And we, in good faith, operating under the context that both sides wanted a peace agreement and that they wanted a neutral force, a referee, we were going to conduct these operations within that dimension. Now, I accuse myself particularly of the failure of the mission, and one of the dimensions of it was this naivety of the sophistication that existed on the ground. And that comes from the fact that, I was 30 years in the army by then. We were totally Eurocentric. Operations in northern Norway, I come from a Nordic country, was no problem. Operating in the Central European front, there was no problem. However, going into the sophistication of conflict resolution in countries that not only the geography is foreign to us, but more importantly, the whole cultural aspect that make these people tick was totally non-existent.
You know, to me, that's worth the price of admission, if I may say so, because I'm a big believer that you have to understand the history and the culture. And I guess that really...
I discovered all of a sudden that, in fact, in a number of meetings, although the person in front of me had a significant amount of authority, is that rarely was that person calling the shots. It was the person in the second or third row.
Right.
Who
had
listening.
the control and had the power.
That's right. And when you had a break or so on, it wasn't a rush to that person. It was all done in a very subtle fashion. The other thing I discovered is that, as an example, the Rwandans and the Africans I have met have an incredibly deep human culture. They are able to get within themselves and be able to ponder their humanity as we cannot do. Our artificial surroundings prevent us from able to do that.
You know, you take us inside another culture too, and that's the United Nations.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is a tribe of
And
a
that's
different
no
sort.
joke.
And that's no joke indeed. Now, I got to confess a couple of things. First of all, I was, I guess the word is appalled actually, when I realized the paucity of resources you go into these things with. I mean, you were basically fighting for stationery and stamps, to get these things underway. It wasn't a well-heeled operation by any. And then there's something else, because there seemed to be so little money and sometimes so much bureaucracy. You also were compelled to do something, and I love this quote, called situate the estimate.
Yes.
In other words, you know what you need, but you know you're not going to get it. So then you work with a figure you know you can get and make the best of it.
Yes.
Now, to make a long question a short one, despite all these and many other disappointments, you still seem to be a very strong believer in the UN.
Yes.
And so the question is why, and what does it need to do what you think it should do?
I think the UN is still the only impartial and transparent organization in the world, with all its weaknesses. I think that between the UN and its complexity and single nation-led coalitions, usually led by big powers, is that I'll prefer the UN because the fundamental motive behind the UN is its charter, and its charter is humanity. It's human rights, the respect of humanity. Where single nation-led coalitions are dominated by self-interest, by national interest, and yes, of course, an important byproduct is what we can do for humans. The other aspect of it is that in the UN, you have the potential for innovative thinking. You have the potential for innovative solutions. You have the opportunity of marrying complex diplomatic exercises, complex security analyses coming from the orchestra of the world. You see, and so you hope that the orchestra is made up of sections, so you're starting to get sort of feel for that, and that these sections are able to come together to create or to produce music. Now, that doesn't exist as clearly and as evidently outside of the UN. What is emasculating the UN still today is the fact that we don't want to give that the full reign to. The example I like to use is the Iraq scenario. I mean, we spent 50 years in NATO working together against the Warsaw Pact. Yet the debate on Iraq, based on a concept regarding a person or what it can do, split us like it never split us during NATO. How is that possible? And I believe one of the reasons is that we didn't give full opportunity to the diversity of diplomatic solutions or political solutions to run their course. I think that middle powers not only were not given room to be able to bring forward ideas, but in fact were quite passive in finding niches amongst the big powers. And the big powers ended up by tripping over each other because, to my sorrow, there isn't a statesman among them. A lot of politicians, a lot of egos,
but no
a lot of person, but none of the humility, none of the ability to rise above to a higher calling that statesmanship has. And in this time of insecurity that I equate to being worse than the insecurity of the Cold War nuclear age, we're not seeing that come to the fore.
You know, it's interesting. I as a non-expert, non-specialist, and someone whose personal history has not been, as yours has been, caught up in these things, I agree with you. I think this is the most dangerous time I've ever seen. How do we create a constituency for humanity? I mean, because as we sit here in Darfur and Sudan, there's a reluctance to call it genocide or to step forward and say what's really going on there. How do you get people moving in this direction?
Well, I think the first point is that we've got to consider this to be a long-term activity. That is to say that I've come to the conclusion is that I will work for the rest of my life regarding the Rwandan genocide and what it can provide as lessons and so on to advance humanity. But I think it may be 3 or 4 centuries from now that we'll actually stop conflict because of our differences. It won't exist anymore. But it means we're working at it every day, and it means, yes, millions will still die as we make our way towards that. Now, the instrument to move that way is in this era, I speak of this era, is in the maturing of the NGO community.
Non-governmental organizations.
They, I consider to be still at the embryo of their potential. I consider them to be very immature, disparate, and as such, are not bringing the focus that ultimately guides them all, which is human rights and humanity, to be supra capabilities that will influence these nation states who are going to face more and more the question of whether or not things like sovereignty are absolutes.
Right.
In fact, sovereignty is one of the biggest impediments in us being able to intervene in order to be proactive, anticipatory, and even when things go to pot, to actually be able to present ourselves. So I think the thrust is that look at that NGO community and its potential and join it.
Yeah.
But you know, there's an interesting dimension, if I may raise here. The United States at the time decided it was very committed in Yugoslavian stuff and not into Rwanda for a variety of points of view. But there was one side of the United States that I have not been able to come to grips with, and it's the following. The African American community in the States that rightfully is seeking its roots in Africa, that is exchanging with its African heritage and so on. And I think that is one of the most progressive moves that have been done by a minority in a nation. However, why did they remain passive?
You know,
Totally out of the exercise in the slaughter of Africans. And you'll say, well, yeah, I mean, why put it on us? I'm not linking it in any sort of nasty fashion. I just thought that if anybody who in this nature has a sense of humanity, who has suffered, who through being a minority is so absolutely sensitive to the strength of its culture and its background, would have said, hey, let's take another look at this.
you've given us a very powerful point throughout this conversation, throughout this book, and many feel as you've just expressed, sir.
Oh, marvelous.
Yes, they do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, not just for the conversation, but for the book, and may I say so, your continued interest in what you're doing. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wwic.si.edu. I'm George Liston, CA, and you have been watching Dialogue, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Please join us again next week, and thank you for watching.